Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. We post these conversations on average once a week as part of the larger mission of the Skeptic Society. We're a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization, and you can support us at skeptic.com/donate. And there you can do it through Patreon or PayPal, through our own Shop Skeptic donation page, by check in the mail, or you can even phone us. And to that extent, I'd like to thank everybody that does support the podcast as well as the society. This is what drives us. And my guest for this episode is Michele Gelfand. Her book is Rule Makers and Rule Breakers: How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. Michele is a distinguished university professor of psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her pioneering research into cultural norms has been cited thousands of times in the press, including in the New York Times, Washington Post, Harvard Business Review, and Science, and on NPR. The recipient of numerous awards, she is a past president of the International Association for Conflict Management. I have to say, this was one of the best conversations I've had in the 50 plus we've done of the Science Salon podcasts. Her book is just endlessly fascinating, talking about different cultures within societies, cross-national differences, families, any kind of group differences in which there is tightness or looseness in the culture. So we cover a lot of ground in terms of just personally how we engage with other people based on this particular dimension of tightness and looseness, all the way up to Trump and nationalism and populism and why Trump won and what's going on in Europe and why European Union is different from the United States and what that's done for their cultures and yet preserving their cultural differences and language differences, for example. We talk about Jonathan Haidt's his moral foundations theory and George Lakoff's conceptual idea of the family model for national metaphors for how a nation should be run, the strict father family model versus the nurturant family model, and how all this ties into her theory. We get into her many travels and some of these really radically different cultures, like in Japan and Singapore, where they're really super tight. And yet the people seem to like that and how people adjust to these kinds of norm differences. Anyway, so enjoy this conversation. I think it was really one of the best, if not the best, that I've done so far. So I thought I'd come at this a couple of different ways, just anecdotally. I think I told you this story via email that my wife's from Germany, a traditionally tighter culture than the United States. And even worse, I'm from Santa Barbara. So, we're pretty, California, pretty loose here. So anyway, we moved to Santa Barbara and so we live up this hill. Where at the bottom of the hill, there's a three-way light. So you can only go left on my street when the left arrow is on, green arrow. But sometimes we come home in the middle of the night and, it's a red arrow and there is nobody, within any eye shot. So I just go. And, my wife is like, what do you do? It's red. It's like, yeah. So, that's for suckers. In a sense, it's like being from New York City. People just cross the street when it's safe to cross the street, and
that's right.
And not that many people actually pay attention to the walk signs. And I don't know, that seems like kind of a fun example of cultural differences in these norms.
Yeah. And it also shows how it comes up in families, like our family conflicts, whether it's a vacation or finances or how to raise kids, can actually really be affected by the tight-loose distinction. We don't often know that we really have big differences in our default setting on tight-loose, even at the individual level. So it's something I actively negotiate with my husband, with my kids, with the people around me, once you understand these differences and where they come from.
Yeah, the fun part about the book is it applies to so many different areas, national differences and globalism and all the big issues, and then all the way down to how you interact with your kids and your own home life. So back on the big picture, my other introductory comments here, a couple of quotes I've used in my books and talks from John Stuart Mill's 1859 on liberty: a party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. And then from Bertrand Russell in his History of Philosophy, from 600 BC to the present day, philosophers have divided into those who wish to tighten social bonds and those who wish to relax them. It is clear that each party to this dispute, as to all that persists through long periods of time, is partly right and partly wrong. Social cohesion is a necessity, and mankind has never yet succeeded in enforcing cohesion by merely rational arguments. Every community is exposed to two opposite dangers: ossification through too much discipline and reverence for tradition on the one hand, and on the other hand, disillusion or subjection to foreign conquest through the growth of an individualism and personal independence that makes cooperation impossible. So really, your research is, like so many social scientists, is bringing empiricism to some very old ideas and to test them. Is it true?
Yeah. Actually, I would add to his analysis that some groups veer tighter or focused on cohesion and order, and some groups veer looser toward freedom and permissiveness for good reasons from an evolutionary point of view. So we're going to bring in some of the more recent evolutionary theorizing, some social science, along with some philosophy to try to really understand patterns around the world and perhaps promote some empathy across nations, states, organizations, et cetera. And hopefully through a pretty parsimonious lens. That's the goal of the book.
Yeah, well, I think you accomplished that. Although I think just to drill down deep on how you know you're measuring tightness and looseness, and I'm going to come at it from a completely different subject. In my book Heavens on Earth, I was about the afterlife and immortality and all that. I ran into terror management theory, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is this idea that the driving force behind all civilization is this fear of death, and therefore we have to be creative and so on. Anyway, so I was querying my friend Frank Sulloway, a psychologist at UC Berkeley, and he writes this is what I'm asking is how do they know that's what they're measuring, this unconscious terror of death? So Frank says the really tricky thing with theories like this is not what to do with statistical refutations, but rather what to do with supposed statistical confirmations. This problem previously arose in connection with psychoanalysis. And Hans Eisnick and others later wrote books showing that these zealous psychoanalytic devotees testing their psychoanalytic claims systematically failed to consider what other theories, besides the one researchers thought they were testing, would also be confirmed by the same evidence. So how do you know you're measuring tightness, looseness, and it's not something else?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, this is essentially a question of construct validity in psychology. You want to make sure what you're measuring is purporting to measure this underlying construct, which is unobservable. And the way that we come at it from a cross-cultural psychology point of view is to try to get convergent evidence from different methodologies. So, for example, in the science paper, we can directly assess what people perceive to be the level of norm strength around them, but we can also then correlate those measures with other measures that indicate very similar phenomenon. For example, if cultures are tight, they should have more order in terms of even having more similarity in city clocks around the world. We could see that tight cultures have more uniformity and accuracy when it comes to that kind of measure. We could see when we observe people on city streets that tight cultures should have a more restricted range of behaviors that you actually observe on city streets. So we actually did that and correlated it with our measure. We can also try to use other methods to test the theory about the evolution and consequences of tight-loose using not just field measures, but experimental measures, computational work, neuroscience. And that's really what I've been trying to do for the last 20, 25 years, is try to get at this construct using different methods. I would call it sort of conceptual replication that helps us to have confidence in our findings. In fact, cross-cultural psychologists have been talking about replication for for decades, even well before this replication crisis or opportunity has come up, that you can't trust your findings until you see them replicating with different methods. So that's what we've been able to show with a lot of the work we do.
Kind of a consilience approach. Different lines of inquiry keep coming to that same conclusion, which bolsters our confidence that there's something real going on
Yeah,
there.
that's right. I mean, we try to also control for other factors that could be driving our results, things like GDP or Gini or other macro types of factors. I mean, tight loose isn't the only thing that explains what's happening around the world or in organizations or in states, but it's definitely an important factor alongside others. We try to, the science paper took probably 10 years to actually publish because when you're doing cross-cultural research, you need to pilot things extensively, like even the measures. We have to make sure people interpret these measures the same way in different cultures. We have to factor analyze, we call it, is the same structure in one culture in terms of how the measure is operating the same as in another structure. We have to look for response sets. Like, do some people use certain parts of the scale in one culture than the other? Are they interpreting a whole situation, this experiment, the same in different cultures? So it takes a long time to pilot these measures, to implement the study, to gather data on ecological and historical correlates that we were putting our money on or putting NSF's money on, and then to analyze the data with a lot of care in terms of dealing with cultural issues and how people respond to research scale. So it took quite a long time to actually get this study together. And I knew it would. I had no problems with that.
What is your background? How did you get into studying tight, loose cultures, or cultural psychology, it's called, right?
Yeah, that's right. So life happened to be making other plans, as many people say. I was an undergraduate at Colgate University. I wanted to become a medical doctor, loved to study the brain. And I had sort of stumbled into culture accidentally. I went to London for a semester, and I was the first kid outside of my New York family to go abroad. And I had that kind of typical New Yorker view of the world, the sort of like, there's New York, there's New Jersey, but then there's the rest of the world. That's how I saw the world. And I got to London and I was totally freaked out. I mean, honestly, I'd had so much culture shock even in London. And I remember calling my father and telling him about how much culture shock I'm having. He's from Brooklyn. And I said, among other things, people are just going from London to Paris for the weekend or to Amsterdam. And he said to me something that I'll never forget. He said, well, imagine like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania. And I thought, wow, Pop, that's an awesome metaphor. So literally, this is a true story. The next day, I booked a trip to Egypt by myself. I figured, why not go to California, Dad? It's from New York to California. He was not too happy about that. But anyway, I started traveling around and I discovered, wow, how is that possible? I don't know anything about culture and how much it's affecting my own behavior. You come from a certain culture and until you get out of it, you don't realize you're even from your own culture. So I came back to Colgate and luckily took a class with Caroline Keating, a cross-cultural developmental psychologist. And there I learned about a lot of very interesting things about how even basic visual illusions, like the Meyer illusion, is not even universal. She was doing work in Africa with Marshall Siegel on this, showing that people in Africa did not fall victim to this bias that Americans do. And I thought it was fascinating. And I looked at the textbook in psychology and I thought, wow, this field is really pretty American and pretty Western. And so I decided to start to study culture from a scientific point of view. I wasn't sure what to go into anthropology, international relations, political science, but luckily through a different phone call, I discovered the work of Harry Triandis, who is one of the founders of the field, and he was in Champaign-Urbana. So once I got into that program, I knew I'm going to work with Harry, and the rest was history.
So it's a sort of a combination of cultural anthropology and social psychology without
yeah, that's right. It's really...
The weird, WIRD, that's always been a kind of a restriction on regular experimental psych, is that most of the subjects are just undergraduate college students in America.
Yeah, I think, the pioneers of the field, like the Harry Triandises and the Marshall Siegels, they were doing this work in the 60s and 70s and writing about this, they didn't use the word weird, but they were also talking about cultural systems. How do you understand the multi-level nature of cultural systems, from ecological, historical factors to socio-political institutions to situations and to psychological processes, all sort of as an interrelated system. And that's what Harry was really pioneering. And he was one of the first cross-cultural psychologists to argue, among a couple of others, that culture is not random, that it evolves for semi-adaptive reasons, or at least adaptive at some point in time. And so I took that to really to heart and started to study why do certain cultural norms and values evolve in the first place and with what consequence for human groups. So he's always been kind of an evolutionist. He didn't call it that, but I feel really fortunate to have studied with him. I planned on becoming a cross-cultural trainer and working at the State Department. I wanted to train Baker and Aziz to negotiate. That was happening at the time. I was really disturbed by the fact that a lot of senior diplomats might not have a lot of cultural intelligence or understand cultural values and differences. And then I discovered academia, and I thought, okay, if I can get paid to do research, I'll do that. So that was the kind of career trajectory.
It is a great life for sure, but I would imagine that people in the State Department should be reading this book or the technical papers or both and saying, well, okay, if we're going to invade a country and then the troops leave and then we leave behind some advisors to help set up a democracy and so forth to make the world safe for democracy. And there's cultural differences that we damn well better know how to deal with that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is a lot of people think about intelligence or emotional intelligence. They don't often think about cultural intelligence. And there's a really interesting emerging field on how do you measure CQ, what's its impact on things like negotiation, leadership. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book. I mean, I've been kind of stuck in the ivory tower for a long time. I love doing research. I love training PhD students. I'm just super curious. I love to do interdisciplinary research. I bring in people, as far and wide as possible to study the same questions. But I realized, we're really speaking to a very narrow community. Even my own father, the engineer from Brooklyn, he was like, can never understand a word I'm talking about. And so I made a commitment to try to get outside of the ivory tower, and that was the purpose of this book. My dad read every chapter. I had the pop test, and I really liked the idea of getting outside of academia and trying to talk to people about it. So many smart people who are just not connected to science, and we're not trained to do that. So it's really been a great joy to do it.
CQ, that's a thing. Cultural intelligence.
Yeah, I've actually measured it. And looked at how it impacts intercultural negotiations. When you bring people into a negotiation, I study negotiation also in the Middle East, and I teach negotiation to both undergrads and executives. I'm kind of quasi-religious about the topic because it's so important, and it's such an important skill and a muscle to build. But this study was one of the first studies to show that CQ predicts above and beyond IQ or EQ in terms of actually being able to come up with negotiated agreements. And so it's a really important skill to have. It's also an important skill going abroad for expatriates, for global leaders. Many times people are promoted based on their technical expertise versus their cultural expertise. And that's a problem. So we're trying to get the word out.
There's your next book title, Cultural Intelligence. And then you can talk about like group differences in cultural intelligence and racial differences and gender differences, and then get yourself in hot water.
No, that's right. I mean, I like to think like Herodotus said that all groups are ethnocentric. All humans are ethnocentric. They sort of see the world through their own point of view. And it's not just Americans that I'm, doing research with. And it's also around the world that people tend to think about their own culture, and they need to get outside and be trained to think about others. There was a great study by Richard Schrader, a cultural psychologist, where he went to India and he was talking about, telling Indian students, American widows eat fish. Is that okay? And they were like, absolutely not. That's terrible. And he's like, is that a sin? And they said, yeah, that's a great sin. And he said to them, should the world stop eating fish? Should widows stop eating fish? And they said, yeah, the world will be a better place if widows stop eating fish. And they did the same experiment in the United States. And Americans asked the same question. They said, why shouldn't widows be allowed to eat fish? Like, this is no big deal. And the same thing, widows should be allowed to eat fish and the world will be a better place. And it was this really interesting question that people saw morality through their own points of view. Turns out that in India, eating fish, I didn't know this, is kind of an aphrodisiac, and it might make the widow actually cheat on her deceased husband. There's some sort of explanation around this. And so that's the reason. I always ask my students, what's the reason for this? And they come up with all sorts of crazy ideas. But there's a logic. I mean, Americans are not as worried about those things. And so the idea of legislating the widow not to eat fish is preposterous. But it's really important to kind of try to empathize with why these differences evolve in the first place. And that's also what I talk quite a bit about in the book is why do cultural differences in the strength of norms develop, and why might we empathize with, for example, why Singaporeans don't bring large quantities of gum into the country. Like if we live there, we might understand why that rule makes sense.
Because it's so packed and you're going to be stepping on a lot of gum and it gets into elevator doors. I think you talked about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, to a certain extent, some of this feels random and crazy, like circumcision or, not eating meat on Fridays or not mixing fibers or whatever Old Testament kind of rules. So, I mean, amongst atheists, there's debates about this. Like there were good reasons why those rules developed in the first place, so we shouldn't criticize them. Maybe we can say they don't apply now. And so that's kind of what you're after, is like some of these norms, like how far apart people stand from each other. I forget that personal space distance. I mean, people were writing about that in the 60s, you know, or any of the other measures. Maybe there are original historical reasons for it that are not apparent now.
Yeah, what's interesting is that we all follow these kind of social norms endlessly on a daily basis. You know, social norms on rules for behavior. We don't even realize it. You know how kind of arbitrary some of them are. You know, like why I'm even wearing like not a bikini right now during this interview. You know, I could be wearing like a bathing suit, or I can like go outside and I can kind of walk up to strangers and start getting all handsy with them, or walking very close to them, or often it's the case that we don't realize how much we need social norms. Like they really help us to coordinate and predict each other's behavior. And it's really been one of the most important human inventions that's helped us to sustain cooperation. Even things like, why do women wear, white on the most important day of their lives, or why do people cut down trees and let them die in their bedroom, in their living rooms on Christmas? These are all norms. They're all things that we've just come to be accustomed to, and not all norms are needed, but certainly we need norms in general to coordinate and predict each other. And some cultures need stronger rules and punishments to survive. And that's really what the bottom line was in some of the research I was doing for the book.
Yeah, I think there's some tensions here with things like veiling or the burqa, female genital mutilation, these kinds of things that are kind of forefront now as perceived to be civil rights violations of women's rights from a Western perspective, but maybe from another culture's perspective, that's you Westerners intruding on our culture. None of your business. But then when it's something like female genital mutilation, that seems like a different level of cultural
That's right.
norms that are objectively wrong.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting, as a cross-cultural psychologist and a feminist, I often have those kinds of dialogues with myself. And I've come to the very similar conclusion. If the practice is about harm, about physical harm, like genital mutilation, then we need to really start thinking about how do you best understand why that norm has evolved and how to actually go in and change it. With something like the burqa, it serves some really important purposes, both religious, but also even secular, in terms of preventing harassment and other types of phenomenon in the Middle East and elsewhere. And what's interesting, though, the same idea about, not understanding social norms, a lot of times when people have been going into context and trying to change these norms, like genital mutilation, or even like things like sending kids to school or preventing early childhood marriage, they tend to target attitudes versus social norms. It's kind of this individualistic perspective. But we could just get people to change their attitudes, they'll change their behavior. And it's just such a wrong approach to understanding what's going on in these tight communities, that people are engaging in kind of a coordination problem where even if they change their attitudes, it doesn't mean they'll change their behavior. And I think more and more UNICEF and the World Bank and other places have gotten this kind of perspective on social norms. And I think in my general view, I think the challenge is to think about what norms do we need to loosen that become too tight, and what norms do we need to tighten up that become too loose. Like, we've invented norms, and we need to kind of be mindful, and in this kind of intentional world of trying to design systems that have a healthy balance. And so there's examples on the flip side. The internet is a great example of a place I think has gotten far too loose. It needs to tighten up in some ways. So it goes on either direction. And organizations also, those that get too tight, I heard about it last year in terms of United, arguably need more discretion. They need to loosen up a little bit. I call it flexible tightness. On the flip side, some organizations like Tesla or Uber arguably getting wildly loose, like the norms are wildly too loose, and they need to tighten up a little bit. And that's something I call structured looseness. So I try to present toward the end of the book a more kind of dynamic, agency-focused approach to norms, whereby even in our own households, we could decide what domains do we need to be tight in and what domains should we be loose in. And it's something I'm really excited about to do. I negotiate this with my kids all the time, my teenagers, and I think sometimes my husband gets irritated because he's tighter than me. But anyway, I think the point is that we can harness the role of social norms to change norms that have gotten too tight or that are harmful to people, but also tighten them up when they become too loose.
Well, here you're making a jump from is to ought. This is the way something is, but we ought to do something about it. Well, how do you know? What's the objective outside criteria that you're using to say you ought to do this? Okay, so we touched on one, physical harm. Here I'm reminded of the practice of sati in India. And when the British colonized India, they said, you're going to stop doing this. You can't kill widows. And they said, well, this is our cultural tradition. And the general in charge said, well, our cultural tradition is if you kill women, we hang you. So you go ahead and practice your cultural tradition, and we're going to practice our cultural tradition. Yeah. We will hang you if you do this to women. And they eventually stopped. So that seems pretty clear. But if it's something like, the burqa. So like my friends Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they describe this as, you're putting a cloth bag over women. This is wrong. And one of the responses is, well, but men will harass these women if they show too much skin. To which my wife says, that's the dude's problem.
Yeah.
Why should women have to, just cover themselves because some guy can't control his hormones? So I kind of see, I can see both sides of that, because another counter on the other side is, well, American women running around in bathing suits or crop tops and tight pants and this kind of stuff is too loose.
Yeah.
And so I tend to err on the side of freedom and more looseness, but, I kind of see some of these arguments. But the burqa thing, that seems, right on the cusp. Like, it's just a clothing, but on the other hand, it is bagging women, and that's too tight, it feels.
Yeah, like. I think it's interesting also from an American perspective. We often overgeneralize the constraint that women have in the Middle East. We don't understand the power that they have in private context, for example, and how much power they have in their households with their families. We tend to think of, for example, in our interviews, Americans thought of Pakistanis, both women and men, to be completely constrained. They don't imagine them reading poetry and playing sports and, goofing off. And when we interviewed Pakistanis, they thought Americans were not just loose, but like drinking all the time and calling the police on their parents when they get too strict and half naked all the time. They didn't think about Americans in contexts where we were much tighter, like in the workplace, or they didn't think about us having family dinners. And what was really interesting, we did a study where we randomly assigned people in Pakistan and the US to read diaries of people in the other country for a week. These are actual diaries, like unedited diaries. And so these diaries clearly showed Pakistanis were living tighter lives, more constrained, which a lot of people disagree with. Why can't they have more freedom? And Americans clearly had less constraint. But after they read these daily diaries after a week, compared to people who read diaries of people in their own countries, they changed their attitudes. They reduced their cultural distance tremendously. Pakistanis started seeing the similarities that they had with Americans and vice versa. They commented that, they were different, but we're not nearly as different as we had thought. So I think when we take one cultural practice and we generalize to the rest of the country, it's pretty problematic. And I think it's good to also get out and talk to people, to women in this context, about their thoughts about the burqa and other practices. Same here in the United States.
Yeah, so like the practice of polygamy, we sometimes watch these, sister wives shows, or I've read a fair amount about this, and most Americans are appalled by this. But if you ask the women that are living in these homes, they can't legally be married, so they're sister wives. But they'll say, yeah, we like it. Mind your own business. It's like, okay, my libertarian propensities, yes, okay, I can see that, but it just feels wrong.
Yeah. I think, that's right. I think that, this is where you get to that, kind of relativist perspective versus universalist perspective. I think, again, my criteria is about harm, whether it's the person or to the country. In that context, I would say that if it's involuntary, then it's definitely very harmful.
But in this case, the counter to that, well, this is what I want. They've been raised since they were little girls. This is what you're going to do. They have no idea what the rest of the world's like.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think that's right. That's where it's been forced upon you. And I think that's where culture, not every cultural practice is something that we could say, is correct or evolved for good reasons, but many do. And understanding why, for example, Americans tend to be loose because it has less threat than, let's say, Singapore or Japan, where there's many more rules to follow, would make sense. Because in general, rules help people to coordinate and predict each other's behavior. And after the Boston bombing, actually, we went out to Boston and we could see that immediately people want more rules. When there's threat and it's a collective coordination problem, people feel safer and want rules to help coordinate. And it's something we found in the laboratory, in the field. We find it in our evolutionary game theoretic models, that cooperation and punishment evolves quickly when there's threat. And so it helps us to understand why some cultures might have more rules and have more constraint, sacrifice freedom for order. And it can also help people understand why places like New Zealand, that has very low population density and much less threat, comparatively speaking, allows people to walk barefoot in banks, or has very high levels of, sexual permissiveness that might not be something that's allowed in other cultures. So I think that we can sort of zoom in and say some practices we might disagree with, but in general, we can look at cultures differently once we see why they evolve the way they do.
So the evolutionary origins of tightness, looseness dimension has to do with threat. And the world's a dangerous place. And life is nasty, brutish, and short without civilization. And so we got to have norms. So it seems like the entire history of civilization is along the lines of trying to find the right balance, that your Goldilocks principle that you describe in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think, many people have talked about it before, Plato and Confucius and Hobbes, who argued for rules, and then John Stuart Mills and Freud to some extent also, who thought rules caused psychoses. And what we were trying to show in some research is that it's really not either or, it's both. And really what's a problem is when you get to the extremes, either extreme tightness or extreme looseness. Extreme tightness being super repressive, extreme looseness being super unpredictable and chaotic, and what Durkheim called anomie, basically. We could see in our data that those extremes produce high suicide, they produce high instability. It also is a principle that applies even to other levels, even the brain. When there's too much synchrony or too little synchrony among brain regions, it causes different disorders. Among birds who are flying together, those that are too synchronized or totally asynchronized have more problems when they're dealing with threats for different reasons. Again, being too coordinated makes, a predator just zoom right in and get all those birds. If you're too undercoordinated, then no one can communicate about the threat. And so it's a principle, Goldilocks, as I was researching for this book, that applies in so many ways to organizations, to households, to parenting even. And so it is about saying, look, groups have to veer tight or loose for different reasons, but we have to really worry about getting too extreme. And a lot of what I see around the world actually is, these pendulum shifts between these two extremes is something that is pretty predictable, whether it's Arab Spring or ISIS taking over different areas that had total unpredictability and anomie, or Duterte, who's very popular for reasons that puzzle many Americans. I do a lot of work in the Philippines on terrorism, and you could see how much the society had been deteriorating into really chaotic disorder. I don't agree with a lot of his practices, but I agree with the fact that strong leaders are needed more in those contexts when there's a lot of disorder.
But someone like Kim Jong-un goes too far with controlling everything that his citizens do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And leaders throughout history, they kind of capitalize on tight loose theory. They don't call it that, but they tend to activate threat, amplify threat, and even target groups who feel very threatened realistically in order to gain popularity. We've seen it over the centuries that this is a common pattern because, it's not just about objective threat. Perceived threat is just as powerful. Even if our society is becoming less threatened, as Steven Pinker would argue, people feel more threatened, strangely enough. It's just this sense of that there's disaster out there, and through the internet and the kind of algorithms that we sort of get pushed through on the internet make people feel more threatened. And we know from our research that people, when they get threatened, they want greater tightness. They want strong leaders. They start becoming more ethnocentric. And so part of the question for me, and I think for many of us, is how do you decipher real from objective threat? Because we know that groups that have a lot of threat need greater order, and they are more synchronized, they're more cooperative, they have more self-regulation, but they also tend to be less creative, and they're less open-minded. They're more ethnocentric. And on the flip side, loose groups, they're really pretty disorganized and they have a lot of self-control problems, but they're very creative and open-minded. So that order versus openness trade-off, if it gets too miscalibrated, it could be problematic because that necessitate tightness.
Yeah, this is the problem with the availability heuristic in watching the news. If that's all you do and you never look at the long-term trends, you just follow the headlines instead of the trend lines, you're going to think the world's a dangerous place and I better not leave my home.
There's some statistics, for example, that like the number of jihadi terrorists that have caused damage in the U.S. since 9/11 is like something really small, 6 to 10 or something per year. And you can compare that to like 300 people or more that die in their bathtubs every year. Right. These are somehow, it's not, it's because it just feels more dangerous.
30,000 from gun violence alone, homicides or deaths by gun. Imagine what Republicans would do, compared to what they've done with terrorism, if they applied that to gun violence.
I think it's super interesting from a tight loose point of view, the whole gun control issue.
Yeah, why is that different than terrorism?
Yeah, it's basically, I think that people on different sides of the divide think you should be monitoring and controlling things through rules in a different way. So for Democrats and liberals, it tends to be the government should be intervening with their own rules. And for Republicans and for people on the right, it's more like, no, we should be monitoring in our own communities. We should make sure that we're tight in these communities and prevent this stuff from happening. And I think we need both. I mean, we're in a loose culture. We have a huge number of guns. There's no other combination of that cocktail anywhere around the world. No. There's lots of guns in Switzerland, but there's very strong norms. It's a tight culture. And so you could see why it offsets this problem. Here we have so many guns and we have such a loose culture. We tend to not have a lot of monitoring. Then we have very little government intervention on this. It's a disaster, as some people would say. It's in a sense of that we have all the bad ingredients that produce this very outlier effect.
I don't see any good solution to the gun violence problem. There's just 300 million plus guns. And from the conservatives' perspective, it's a freedom issue. I want the freedom to defend myself from bad guys. And there are bad guys. It's like, yeah, but most people are not bad guys, and there's way more accidents that happen, or your kid or the kid's friends get the gun that's loaded and not locked up and so forth. There's all of that. And, short of becoming a Nazi state and just confiscating all the guns, that's never going to happen. If any government administration here tried to do that, you'd have Waco and Ruby Ridge every weekend.
That's right.
So I don't see any good solutions. In Germany, you can get a gun, but it's quite an ordeal. You have to apply, and they want to know why you want it. Well, I just want it for sport. Okay, you can leave it at the gun club and pick it up when you go there. Mm-hmm. But you can't have guns at home and so on.
Yeah,
it's much.
Well, this is where I think this idea of like too much freedom is a problem. This is part of the Goldilocks issue is that we live in a context where we need to balance order and freedom. And we have to be able to compromise on even small steps that reduce people's freedom when it comes to guns. And it will have, once it shows us having an impact, we might be able to negotiate even better solutions to this. But it's grounded in our sort of idea that we always don't want to be restricted. I hear about the internet. The internet brings a lot of great opportunities, connections, efficiencies, but it's a normless place. And people have been talking about how time online causes, or it's related to low happiness and suicides. But I think what we're missing is that it's because of the nature of the social interactions online, where psychologists know when you're not being monitored, you behave badly. There's no question about it. There's been experiments for years that show that. And I'm actually working with some people now, some economists, to try to think about how can you nudge people through very small ways online to behave in a more civil way? We operated as groups for millennia in face-to-face context where people were accountable. It didn't mean that we couldn't express ourselves. Now we're in a context where we live online all the time, where there's no accountability. There's very little sense of being monitored. And so you hear people saying, I've heard people say this against me. How could she argue to tighten the internet? What, you want us to be like China? And it's like, well, I don't want us to be like China, where they have thousands of people monitoring people online. But we need some more accountability and monitoring. And it's kind of happening bottom up. It's happening through Reddit, with people starting to monitor data. It's happening top down with people taking more accountability at the highest levels of Instagram or Facebook. But it's happened so fast that we need to kind of get on the movement and
I know
and
these social media
strengthen his
companies.
norms.
Yeah, the social media companies are trying to tighten things up by banning certain people like Milo Yiannopoulos or Richard Spencer from Twitter, for example. Yet there's a lot of anti-Semites on there, and so then there's, why aren't you banning this guy who said this joke or this thing about Israel? That's, anti-Zionism. That's kind of anti-Semitism. Why is he still posting? And then you get into the problem of, well, what's your criteria for banning somebody? That gets trickier there.
I think it does. I think we need to start having conversations around what are their criteria and what can we agree on. I think what happens is that people get very nervous about any kind of banning anything, where we know in everyday life we ban people running into a movie theater screaming fire. When it's harmful to people, we'll do that. I also think just small nudges, reminding people that this is a new home for us. Like, this is metaphorically the internet, a place we want to live. Like, how do we want people to behave? How do we want our kids to behave online? Those are different types of questions around just civility. So we'll see. We're starting to do some work on this kind of small nudging online and seeing where it goes in terms of promoting civil behavior.
A couple other things when I was reading your book I thought of, because I just read, let's see, hang on here for a second. Here it is. George Lakoff's book, Moral Politics. And he's a cognitive psychologist, so he works with metaphors. I mean, most of what we do when we're navigating the world is we conceive of things in metaphor. Scientists do this all the time. So his metaphor for national politics is whether you adopt a strict father family metaphor or a nurturant parent family metaphor for the nation. This was an eye-opener to me. It explains a lot. So I'll just read a couple excerpts from him. The strict father model predictably adheres to the traditional nuclear family, with the father having primary responsibility for supporting and protecting the family, as well as the authority to set overall policy. Obedience is the key to building character and self-reliance. Self-discipline, self-reliance, and respect for legitimate authority are the crucial things that children must learn. And this goes on and on. Then applied to the nation, of course, the president and the government, the administration, they're the parent. They should be the strict father, laying down the rules and so on. And then the nurturant parent model emphasizes love, empathy, and nurturance as the key to raising responsible and self-disciplined children. Obedience follows naturally from a child's love and respect for parents, and when children are respected, nurtured, and communicated with from birth, they gradually enter into a lifetime relationship of mutual respect, communication, and caring with their parents. Now, I tend toward the more nurturant parent family as a father, but also as a political commentator. I feel like, we've erred too strongly on the side of that sort of strict father family model. But then reading your book, I see that you have data showing the United States has become looser over 200 years, starting off as more of a strict father family. I'm not sure how you integrate looseness, tightness with Lakoff's model.
Yeah, actually, I love his work. I'm a big fan of metaphor, not as a linguistic device, but a conceptual device. In fact, I just was teaching negotiation yesterday, asked my students, what metaphor do you have for negotiation? Because that's going to affect your behavior. Is it a sport, a dance? Is it a visit to the dentist? As a metaphor, I've heard a lot about negotiation, this kind of necessary evil. Tight loose also overlaps with the metaphors that Lakoff talks about. And in fact, in some recent work that we've done on tight loose and religion, we see the same patterns of what you just described in terms of how people perceive God, how Bible passages can emphasize the loving God, the forgiving God, versus the punitive, monitoring, upset and punishing God. And what we found, and it's very consistent with tight loose theory, is that in contexts where there's a lot of threat, people start seeing God as more punitive. And that's both in the laboratory. We can prime threat about Korea, and Syrian refugees coming here, and people immediately start perceiving God as more punitive. And then when you feel safe, you see God more loving, more nurturing.
Yeah.
We've actually looked over like a couple hundred years about when there's threat, what kind of Bible passages become prominent in the population. I could send you this paper because I know you have an interest in religion.
Yeah.
And we find a really strong connection, cross-lag, that this is a causal story, that threat makes people want a punishing God. And part of the rationale is that under those contexts, you want people to behave themselves. You don't want them to defect. And so a punishing God helps people to to accomplish that, because you know the eye is watching you. So I think one thing I'd add to Lecoq's analysis is that there's some ecological, historical conditions that push those metaphors, and they're dynamic in terms of who wants them and who starts seeing the world in that way, and so forth. And they can change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I thought of reading your book along those same lines, this quote from my favorite movie, one of my favorite movies, A Few Good Men, with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise. You've seen this film, of course. Yeah. So I'm just going to play that short clip. To me, this is the key to the whole movie, and it really gets at this tension between security and freedom. So Tom Cruise is representing a couple of Marines who had roughed up a lacquer of a Marine who wasn't pulling his weight, and things got out of hand, and accident, and the guy died. So they're on trial for murder. And Jack Nicholson, the head of the group there, was basically ordered the code red to go in and rough this guy up to toughen him up, because you got to be tough to be a Marine. And so in the key portion of the trial, for those listening who haven't seen this movie, this is the famous scene where Tom Cruise is pushing him to admit this is what he did. And, I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. And Nicholson's response as to why we need rules and laws is pretty powerful. So I'll just play that one portion.
Let's see it.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's gonna do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You weep for Santiago and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives, and my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand a post. Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to.
Did you order the code red?
Did you order the code? Yes, you're goddamn right, I did. Yeah, so I mean, and the screenwriter for that, who apparently was a liberal, kind of meant to over-exaggerate that conservative, we need walls kind of thing. But the fact is, we do live in a world like that where there are bad people, and I am glad to have a leather, tough Marine on the wall, so that I can have the kind of freedom I want. And yet I'd rather live in a world without walls, in which we just have kind of open borders and open trade, and the internet is a model, and that kind of thing. But, we're a long ways from that, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the military, I wrote about the military context in the book. It's a great example of having very sort of what seems like very trivial rules, like the kind of socks you wear, the haircut that you have to have, because those things seem really trivial. Why do you need those rules? And the whole idea is that if you follow those rules, that you'll be able to follow the very critical rules on the battlefield. That's the kind of assumption, is that more rules are better because it gets people to actually follow things that are far more important. But I think, like in every context, there's the Goldilocks in the military. I'm actually working on a project right now for the military where there's a real concern that the Navy units that are too tight are having a lot of counterproductive behavior off-site. It's like the kid who's like super constrained by his family goes off to college and doesn't know really how to engage in self-control. It's a story that we've heard, a samba we've heard before is, how do people inject a little freedom in that context that needs a lot of rules? What can we kind of negotiate that maybe we can give people a little more discretion? Same with United. It's another example where, they really need rules. You don't want these people on the airline making up all sorts of shit, right? They're in an airline. They need to coordinate. There's a safety issue. But at some point, sometimes these contexts get overly normatized such that people aren't even questioning any rules. And so even in the context of United, we might be able to argue about this in an op-ed, that there's some domains where customers should have more discretion and not have to follow the letter of the book. Actually, there's a recent United ad I saw on the way to Berkeley recently, flying out there, where they actually talk about this, how these employees felt empowered to violate the rules in context that it wasn't threatening safety. And it was almost an advertisement for flexible tightness, because I think that's the risk, is that when these systems get too tight, then they wind up having some really negative effects, both within and outside of the organization.
Yeah, this makes me think of the current campus crisis, that with all the protesters and safe spaces and microaggressions and trigger warnings, and the larger picture that campuses used to be pretty tight, say in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, and then there was that demand, no more in parentis, in local parentis, like, leave us alone, we want to do sex, drugs, and rock and roll, a 60s game, let's have fun. And so dorms turned into big party rooms. And then now it seems like the students are demanding to go back. Like, well, we need some rules and norms. There's too much sex here and not enough consent. We need exact consent. Like in California, the law is now you have to affirmative consent at every stage of a sexual encounter. Well, how are you going to do that short of a contract, or you're videotaping it, or something? Yeah. That seems like now there's kind of this demand for we need to tighten things up. They got too loose.
Yeah, I think that might be the case. I think sometimes looseness, begets all sorts of bad behavior, and in general, it's having few constraints makes people do great things, become really creative, but also do very unethical things. We know that when people, the most creative people are also the people that might break the rules in an unethical way. And so that's where we start thinking about how do we kind of negotiate those rules so that there's this healthy dissent and freedom, but that there's some constraints on people. The same can be said of the Me Too movement. I mean, we know from research on power that people who feel powerful, they take a lot of latitude. They engage in all sorts of, inappropriate behavior. We can even prime people in the laboratory to feel like they're in a powerful position. I can put them at a desk where, they feel like they're a professor, or like my friend Adam Galinsky at Columbia does, just tell people to think about a time you felt powerful. You can't believe what these people do. They just behave in all sorts of weird ways. And I think people don't recognize that women and minorities have been living in tight worlds, something I argue in the book. We have some evidence for that, like women and minorities in our research that violate rules and organizations, whether it's coming to work late or talking on the phone too much, get far stricter punishments than majority members who have more power. And so part of the Me Too movement, in my point of view, is trying to deal with power differences ultimately and looseness that comes with power. So this is, complicated negotiation, but I think once we start thinking about why powerful people are now getting called on these kinds of issues, it's because for a very long time, power went along with lack of accountability and a lack of, essentially allowing for a lot of looseness. And a lot of this movement is it's kind of corrects some of that.
Yeah, I've been amazed that so much of that still goes on. I mean, when I became a professor in the early 90s, by then it was pretty clear you do not have sex with your students. But when I was a student in the 70s, I could see what was going on. It's like, whoa, okay. Yeah. But then in the late 90s, they had those training programs, just to make sure you understand what the rules are. So things tightened up quite a bit there, which is good because of the power differential between professors and students. And yet Hollywood didn't seem to get the memo.
The memo.
Some of these
well, that's
directors.
right. I mean, it's also like a cultural phenomenon. I've studied sexual harassment, and we've developed measures of climates for harassment, like these contexts where this behavior is rewarded, supported, expected. It's a shared norm that this is okay. It's not just an individual level power issue, like I was talking about. It's also a climate and culture issue. And that's where you get all these problems in Hollywood or another context where it's not just about individuals, it's about the whole culture of the place that needs to be really recalibrated. And we have a lot of good evidence on that you can measure climate for harassment. You can see its downstream effects on women. People also don't, I mean, I've known this for many, many years. I worked with Louise Fitzgerald, Illinois, when I was there working with Harry on harassment research. And, women who were reporting harassment, who were challenging the norms from this very sort of low status position, got a lot of shit. They got a lot of backlash. It was really irrational to report harassment because you just got more trouble. And people just don't understand that. The courts don't understand it. They don't understand the power dynamics and the repercussions for trying to challenge that entire system. And so they wind up blaming the victims by saying, you should have just told people about it. So I think part of it is just trying to get the research on this topic out there in common, outside of ivory tower, because there's so much data on this that doesn't get cited and discussed among these, kind of in a media.
Yeah, this brings to mind the Enron scandal, where that eventually blew up because of whistleblower laws that protected insider whistleblowers. It seems like we need whistleblower laws for sexual harassment too.
Yeah.
Maybe there is such a thing. I don't know, but at least the norm to make it okay to report it.
Yeah, that's right. I think the norm to report uncivil behavior, it's norms that are counterproductive everywhere. I do work with hospitals on conflict cultures and how, people, these cultures tend to be passive aggressive, like reporting things that are going on that are counterproductive tends to be really penalized, and so that's right. Trying to change those cultures around healthy reporting, around dialogue is what it's all about. It's not an individual person, a bad apple. It's a system that's allowing this stuff to happen, and punishments for people who are calling it out.
Yeah, I was just at a birthday party for a friend, and one of my cycling buddies and his wife were there, and they're roughly my age, in their late 50s, early 60s, and she was commenting that from years ago she was on a plane in the middle seat, and the guy on her left starts like rubbing her leg a little. She has a dress on, and so she's moving ever closer to the guy to the right. The guy on the right is like, "Do you know that guy?" She's like, "No, I don't know that guy," and so she spent the whole flight just kind of leaning way over. And then now she's telling me, I'm so mad at why didn't I just hit the button for the flight attendant to come over and turn this guy in? I should have done that. And it's like, I'm not sure it's your problem. I think socially the norms are you don't make a big fuss about some little thing like that. And yet maybe that's going to change now.
I mean, actually, I think part of it is just the shock of like, how can this be happening right now? I mean, I think many of us aren't expecting that kind of stuff to happen. So we don't necessarily have a response at hand to kind of deal with it. We're confused. We're not sure what to do about it. Did this really just happen? Is this still happening? I have to say, I do talk a lot with my teenage girls around this stuff. I watch too much Law and Order and Criminal Minds shows, and I constantly going up to my daughter Jeanette's room, and I'm like, "Are you awake, sweetie?" And I like wake her up by accident, and she's like, "Now I am." I'm like, "Look, you should never do this, or if a guy does this," I just try to educate them on what are the possible situations you might encounter, including the one that you just described. I want them to be prepared that the world is pretty safe, but like you got to be ready. And their response was like, "Mom, I'll kill anyone that does that." But you don't know if that's the case when it actually happens.
So would you like to see the norm shifting towards something like that, where women actually start calling men out in public, say, "Dude, that's not cool. Stop doing that." And then other men get the message and the norm shifts, and then guys just stop doing that.
Yeah. By the way, I would say I'd like to see men calling this stuff out. Like I think about these cases, like high profile cases at Harvard or elsewhere, where there's pretty serious evidence over time. I mean, harassment's not, people misunderstand it. It's not just like, "Hey, sweetie, you look pretty today." Like this is a repeated pattern of behavior of either kind of gender negative attitudes toward women or more sexual attempts at unwanted sexual attention. We have scales that measure this stuff. It's not just, a guy's being nice. It's a repeated pattern, and it's also about power. And what I often wonder to myself is, how do the colleagues of these guys not know about this? Like, I asked my husband this. I'm like, don't you notice like weird shit going on with your male friends if they do this stuff? Because I think it's a responsibility of everyone. I think when people continue to do it, it's because no one's calling them out on it.
You mean if a guy says you look pretty, this is actually just the first step before he makes more moves toward harassment?
I don't necessarily think so. I just think the problem with that is that when you're in a work context, like my looks don't really matter for what I'm doing. It's not, think about it like as a job analysis.
On the job, you mean, not strangers in a Starbucks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily like, okay, this is now going to become a harasser. But people who repeatedly are, engaging in attempts at, dates and other things in a position of power, and also have negative attitudes toward women. We looked at this stuff in like manufacturing firms of people putting posters of women on in their lockers, and it's a repeated pattern. It's not just isolated incident. So I think really it starts with accountability coming from the top, from the organization, that we don't tolerate this stuff. It's not just women or men calling it out. I think that what's happened is that this has been a channel that, and maybe one of the few channels that people have felt safe in reporting it. And we want more channels that are happening earlier on in organizations to make people feel psychologically safe and to make people feel accountable. That comes from a top-down organizational culture perspective too.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting. With the Harvey Weinstein case, if there were assistants bringing these women up to his hotel room and then leaving, they had to know what was going on. And as far as I know, they're not being held accountable. I'm not sure anyone even knows who they are that did this. They, employees at his company that for years were bringing female actresses to his hotel rooms. That's part of the system there.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's also, again, you can't expect if you get into that room and then he does what he's doing, that this is actually happening. Like, you don't have a mental model that this person is going to do this. And I think it's just shocking. You just assume this is going to be business. And so, I think that the good news is that as people hear more about this, it will empower organizations to start thinking about, making this stuff stop.
For sure, if for no other reason than for legal protections that you protect your company or your university or whatever. Tell me what you think about this idea. Heather McDonald, I had her on my podcast. She's a conservative. She works for the the American Enterprise Institute, I think it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so her idea about this is that about sexual harassment and like on college campuses and all this stuff is that the norm used to be everybody understood the woman is not going to have sex with you. That's it. The answer is no. Now you can try to change your mind through charm and and so forth, but the answer is no, and you just accept that if she says no. Heather's theory is that in the 60s and 70s, the norm changed where it was just women are going to have sex. That's it. I'm going to get lucky from the guy's perspective. I'm getting lucky tonight. Oh boy. And then she says no. And now she has to talk him into no. And that's much harder to do. And that Heather would like to see us go back to the no norm that for everybody, men understand the women are not going to have sex with you. You can try if you want, but if you don't get any, that's the way it goes. Walk away.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like pretty simple. Like if someone says, get off of me, you get off of her. Like it's like really that's something that to me seems pretty obvious, that if someone's saying, get off of me, stop, then that's the answer. Right, yeah. It's not like, okay, we're just kind of flirting with each other. I think these cases, my sense is they're really about what I just described. And probably a lot of this is clouded by alcohol and drugs and other things that make people lose their judgment and so forth. But I think it's just a matter of like when you hear that and someone says, get off of me, like that's the answer, whether you want something else or not.
Clearly. But her perspective is more political and ideological. And like she differs from, say, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind. What's the problem with campuses? She thinks it's these kind of ideological, religious, political norms that have shifted. Jonathan and Greg think it's more of a parental norms have changed from much looser, like when I was growing up, to much tighter now. All these play dates and the culture of safetyism, and they're so everybody gets a trophy and so on. By the time these kids get to college, they have different expectations than say 25 years ago. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting. Jonathan is a good friend, and we've known each other for many years in the cultural psychology community. I agree with a lot of their analysis. I don't agree with their solution because I think there's a reason why parents are perhaps becoming more helicopter-like, and that's because they feel a lot of threat. They feel the threat of inequality. They feel the threat that their kids are not going to have the same opportunities as they are, and they probably won't. I don't remember being that consumed about my career and my parents being so consumed with my career. I was born in the late 60s. Nowadays, I mean, that's just one of the only threats. There's other threats from the internet. There are some real threats, and I think the solutions in the book, I'm not sure will work. Just to set up, fewer play dates, let your kids play outside. I think, or have them delay a year before they go to college. I think what we have to deal with more directly is why they're feeling so threatened, why they're engaging in this behavior and increasing the rules. Because until we deal with that feeling of threat and the actual issues going on with that threat, the threat of globalization and of losing a sense of American identity and the threat of jobs being lost and all these kinds of threats and inequality are what's driving a lot of it, I think. Mm-hmm. So the solution has to be to deal with the more ultimate cause of the phenomenon versus just letting your kids play.
What's the ultimate cause? What do you mean?
I think it's this feeling that like Thomas Friedman talks about, just the tremendous disruption that we faced. I mean, he did a book talk with me at Maryland. We kind of compare notes at breakfast quite frequently, just talking about his travels and his work in journalism and my work on culture and psychology. And, the United States, we've just gone through this enormous sense of disruption from internet, from globalization, that we're just trying to catch up in terms of the world really not being a stable order that we used to have. And I think parents, my sort of assumption is that parents are responding to a lot of that uncertainty and that sense that, wow, we don't know how we're going to help our kids make money. Like, how are they going to get jobs? How are we going to, have them become, people who do better than us? And so that's the ultimate cause, I think, is how to directly. I think leaders, for example, have to be the ones that are helping Americans deal with, all these disruptions versus just, blaming Mexicans. We have a real opportunity to help people feel like to deal with threat. I wrote about it in the book that, in Germany, like the working class is far more taken care of in Germany because it's pretty tight. And so there are all sorts of kind of mechanisms to help them navigate the job market by having standardized certificates. A lot of things are standardized in Germany, by being able to go to and from organizations. I wrote about this in the book, and I think Thomas Friedman has too, that the United States needs to help the working class to have more of a safety net. We need to get partnerships from businesses, from local community colleges, from all sorts of contacts that help the working class deal with these disruptions. Because the world is changing, and we're not going to be able to go back to a traditional order. That's what Trump and other people promise. But the problem is that train left already, and we have to deal more constructively with the threat. And then maybe we'll have people letting their kids, wander around a little more and not worry about them studying, forever. I don't know why. I don't tend to feel this at the end of one level. I can relate to their data, in Jonathan's book, but maybe because I live in a county where, the kids are in sports, they're playing sports a lot, they're working hard, but they're not obsessed with just grades. And so I think it depends on where you live also, but I trust their trends. I think we need different solutions to the problem.
Well, let's talk about Trump. He strikes me as somebody who's really wound up super tight on your model of wanting to gain control over everything, from closing the borders, building the wall, to manufacturing in America and telling these corporations what they can and cannot do. Unbelievable. I mean, not at all a conservative, economically conservative, or classical liberal or whatever. I mean, it's more of a sort of fascistic control of things. Is that how you perceive Trump and your model?
I think that, before the election, we asked people, trying to figure out why people find him attractive. And it followed the same logic I mentioned, that people who feel threat. We asked people around the U.S. We also did this in France before the French election with Le Pen. And we just asked them, how threatened do you feel by like ISIS or immigrants or Korea or other threats? And the people that felt very threatened by this, or poverty, like the working class, wanted stricter rules. They wanted a tighter society. And they felt that in turn predicted their support for Trump. They felt Trump can provide that. And actually, in our other research, we could see that in tight cultures, people prefer autocratic leaders because they make very quick decisions and they help people to coordinate. So there's kind of an evolutionary logic to it. Same exact pattern in France. So I think understanding why people are voting for him based on real threat, they really feel threatened. And some of these groups are very threatened. We've done work on the working class that I talk about in the book that shows that they're far tighter than the middle and upper class, in part because they're worried about falling into poverty, what sociologists call hard living. And so as early as 3 years old, we can see in our research that 3-year-olds are more attentive to rules and they're more attentive to people violating the rules. So these are socialized very early. So there's a logic around, I think, why people from the working class are attracted to Trump. And I think we have to appreciate that logic. At the same time, I think, like I mentioned earlier, Trump and other populist leaders try to exaggerate those threats. He does it all the time. Actually, in fact, we created, in the process of validating, this new threat dictionary, where we can use this linguistic dictionary to identify in presidential speeches or in blogs and other cases how much people are using threat to try to mobilize communities, because that's really what he does. I mean, I think anecdotally, I would bet a lot of money. He uses terms like disaster and catastrophe and things that are very threatened all the time. And we want to track, what does that language do to people over time? How does it make them become more ethnocentric, less creative? Can we look at this longitudinally? Can we look at this with neuroscience? So that's the kind of goal, is to try to understand the impact that's having on people.
He definitely does that. I mean, from his opening speech about the rapists coming across the border and so on. And yet he'll say something like, North Korea is going to be great. They're going to be our good friend. And I like this guy. And you can all sleep well tonight. I've solved the whole thing. So there he's not using threat. Or we've defeated ISIS. It's over. Don't worry about ISIS anymore. That seems to be the opposite of that. But that's more of taking credit for solving the problem.
Well, what he does is this kind of dual strategy of like, the world's collapsing, but I'll save us, So I'm the solution to that problem. He says that in those speeches too. Like, don't trust the institutions, the democratic institutions, the judiciary, the police. I'm the person who can do this, and I'm the only person who can save us. And that's very attractive black-white thinking to people who feel very threatened. So he activates threats, but then the solution is this, Lakoff's model of like the authoritative father. Like, you guys got to look to me. You can't get rid of me. His strategy negotiation-wise is really bizarre. I think, for someone that touts himself as a great negotiator, he uses a very distributive negotiation style. He constantly is threatening people's face and honor, which are very important commodities in East Asia or the Middle East. In our work in the Middle East, people are negotiating over honor. They're not even negotiating over the contract. They want to make sure that this person respects me and it gives me a sense of worth. And that we can show that with some stuff we published, that you're really negotiating over face and honor in a lot of the cultures. So Trump not only, kind of comes at this in a very distributive win-lose style, but he also insults people all the time and does it publicly, which is a huge problem internationally.
Yesterday, I was talking to I had, Franz de Waal on my podcast, the great primatologist, and so he's got a book coming out. He's got a whole paragraph describing Trump as a chimp, basically, particularly the debate number 2 with Hillary, where he's hovering behind her, and so Franz's interpretation of this is that when chimps, two chimp males would really go at it, but a chimp male cannot thump a chimp female the way he would a male. But so he has to kind of bounce around and hover over like threaten, which is exactly what Trump was doing with Hillary.
And this is probably the first time I've heard Trump being compared to a chimpanzee or to an ape.
Well, of course, Bill Maher does this all the time.
In the real sense.
Bill Maher calls him the orangutan. He always puts the 2 pictures up, the orang and Trump. But what was I going to say there? But Franz does not describe him as an alpha male. He says because alpha males in primates, they're not just. He says Trump is a bully. Alpha males actually want to do the right thing, take care of their group. And they're actually pretty ethical about how they exert their power, whereas a bully is just using power just for his own sake. And that Trump is more like
It's kind of a narcissist concept also, is that, people have argued, is he pathologically, does he have a pathological personality? But narcissism seems to be a pretty, strong trait of his. So insecure, but also very much grandiose.
On your data showing the 200-year history of the United States becoming looser, we just had 8 years of Obama, and there, but for the quirkiness of the our political system, the Electoral College, we would add Hillary. And would we even be talking about any of these concerns of a lurching back to authoritarianism and populism and that sort of thing?
It's interesting. I mean, it's hard. We don't have a control group, but no question, we think that there's certain pockets of the U.S. that are tightening since Trump. Like, our data only go to 2000. And I would bet some money that clearly we've kind of gone on a new trajectory, in part because threat tightens groups. And when you have a leader that's manufacturing threats, even though there are some real threats among the working class, that it's going to tighten groups. And I think the question also is around him not being accountable, because I think that's been a big shift in this presidential context, that, when you do these kinds of things, usually you get called out on it. And for not some reason, for obvious reasons, a lot of the party that he's leading don't want to object and call him out on things. I mean, you've seen a little bit of difference with this new agreement that we'll hear soon about if it gets ratified for the wall. But that's the biggest problem, is that the dynamics have become so polarized that even his own party is not making him accountable for all sorts of norm violations that he engages in. Some of his behavior is not norm violating in the sense that he chooses people that are affiliate with his party, but many of his behaviors are pretty norm violating, not just in terms of Levitsky's stuff on democratic norms, but also sexual norms and etiquette and all sorts of things. We've been cataloging actually now the types of norms that he's violating, just like gathering, we like to construct typologies in psychology, the constructs of what's the multidimensional space of the norm violations. And I'm really interested to go out and actually ask people that support him, what do you think about what he just did? Like, why is this justifiable to talk about women like this or minorities, or why is it justifiable to engage in this inappropriate behavior? Because I think that many people are just excusing his behavior. And that's another problem that we have with the tightening of America, is that he doesn't seem to have any accountability.
Yeah, your analysis makes sense for Trump versus Hillary, because she called them, the flyover country, the deplorables. These are people that are, hardworking, good, moral people, fearful of their jobs and their income and their health care and so forth. But what about Trump versus the other 16 members of, pretty solid Republicans, Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. I mean, these are all pretty good, rule-abiding, tight culture Republicans. How did he beat those guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he was underestimated in terms of how much threat people felt. People who felt disenfranchised and felt on the brink of disorder felt like finally we have a savior that's going to bring us back to this tight traditional order. And if I were in that case, I probably would find him appealing also. I think we have to put ourselves in people's shoes. And Democrats really missed out on that whole demographic of people who feel like they're really losing out. These towns where there's just manufacturing has been decimated and there doesn't seem to be much hope. And so I don't think any other candidate would have come close to what he does because he's destroying a lot of the democratic norms that are allowing other leaders around the world to also take a lot of latitude. Norm violations become kind of contagious. We know that from research. When you see a senior person in the United States of America, the most senior person in the whole country doing this stuff, then other people in other countries think that this is acceptable. I think that's what's really scary, because we're tightening up in ways that are not good and loosening up in ways that are also not good in the world order. Speaking of the world order.
Franz's answer to that question was that he basically hammered the other apes down. So little Marco and Lion Ted and low energy Jeb. So, these are our fellow Republicans, but they're weak. They're very weak. You need a strong person to save you. So I think
that's the authoritarian kind of personality. It's like, and you can hear him say that around the world, like even like Canadian prime minister is weak, or, the German Merkel is weak. I mean, he does it all the time. It's not, and I think for people who want to be back in a traditional order where they feel safe and feel significant, that kind of line of argument actually works pretty well. Because we'll be strong again. We're not going to be weak.
Interesting. He couldn't do that with Carly Fiorina because she was a really strong woman, so he had to attack her looks. Didn't he say something about you want a face like that? I mean, it's embarrassing how crude the signals are he sends.
Yeah, we have that in our list of norm violation categories.
Right.
By the way, I wanted to mention that I would love to have your job. Like, you must just have a great job. You're a professor, but you also get to interview people and learn about everything. I'm kind of massively learning oriented. So I just can't imagine what your job would be like. You just interviewing people,
it's fun.
Writing these cool books. And I mean, is that a great life for you?
It's a good
how
life.
would you describe it? I'm just hyperventilating at your kind of life that you get to do that.
It's a good life, particularly in Santa Barbara, where it's not as cold as where you are, but
it's better, yeah.
No, I love integrating a lot of these ideas. I mean, like Jonathan's, five moral foundations with your tightness, looseness, and all that. I mean, there's no single social science theory that can explain everything, and we really need all of these different avenues to angles to come in. I have kind of a vision of, again, I mentioned sort of not just open economic borders, but open political borders. Again, but we don't live in that world. We live in a world with walls, and on those walls are men with guns and all that stuff. How can we get past that tribal nationalism? I mean, the nation state's only a couple centuries old as a concept, and yet it seems so ingrained. And now
Yeah, I mean, I think that, a lot of people who study identity in cultural psychology would say that you need both kind of an identity of your own country, but also a global identity. Like that's the healthy balance. It's not having just a global identity without having a national identity. Or that's not good either, because you have to have this sense of like, I have a home and I have a group, but also having a global identity makes you really appreciate, other people. But on the flip side, having only a national identity, not a global identity, is a problem also, because then it gets to a lot of ethnocentrism. And that kind of dual identity model, it seems to work in a lot of contexts, including when people come to the United States. We kind of misunderstand immigrants that we think, oh, they should just assimilate. But actually, the healthiest people, immigrants, are those that maintain their culture, but also embrace American culture. They call it integration types of styles. And people who separate from their culture and kind of are not engaged in American culture, or who just try to assimilate, who forget about their culture, have pretty negative psychological outcomes. And you can kind of extrapolate that to the global level. Like, we need leaders who help us feel like we're a great country, but we're going to be global. Like, that's a good combination, that hybrid kind of cultural identity at the national level. Unfortunately, what Trump does, and many populists do, is they do the opposite. They say, well, forget the world. Like, we're the best. We don't need the world.
Right.
And that's a problem. So I think in the next election, we'll hopefully have someone who can help us feel that sense of dual identity, that safety with your own culture, but also openness to others.
Yeah, there's a couple of new books out now about sort of in favor of tribal or nationalism, why nationalism is a good thing.
Yeah.
But again, it's like you could have the little circle, it's me and my family in my home, and then my neighborhood, and then my city, Santa Barbara, and my state, California, my country, America, and then, the world. And then you're at Carl Sagan's pale blue dot. I mean, here's just one pixel in a photograph. And, on that little blue dot is every person who ever lived, every national leader, and he goes through that beautiful soliloquy. And that's that cosmic perspective that people like Carl tried to bring to get us out of just those, expand the circle one more level, and that might chip away at some of that.
Yeah, I think also in the sort of the emerging climate change issues and the fact that we're facing global threats is a really important driver of having that perspective of like uniting across borders. In the book, I talk a little bit about how cultures that are threatened by natural disasters, instead of becoming more tight and ethnocentric and tribal, who help each other and coordinate, have the benefit of both coordination to deal with these external threats, like in India and Bangladesh or Greece and Turkey, but they also have the openness that you get from looseness. And so my kind of dream would be that we could scale up the level of cooperation even more across groups to deal with collective threats. That's kind of a small fantasy, but I think it's possible. I gave some examples of places that do that. And of course, we need strong leadership to do that. We need people who say, we're dealing with very similar threats, and we have to come together during these times. And maybe a certain level of cooperation will evolve on a much larger scale than it has ever in our history.
Seems like climate change would be the equivalent of the aliens are coming to invade Earth, and we all have to work together to this problem.
Yeah.
The only way to get around that, for the people that don't like that idea, they like nationalism, is just to say it isn't real.
It's not happening.
It's not happening. Yeah. You must be encouraged by the last 25-year history of the EU being able to unify such different groups that were, spoke different languages and had completely different cultures, rather different cultures anyway. And it's done fairly well, although lots of bumps along the way. But that's an encouraging model for you, I would think.
I think so. I mean, I think especially that this is the context that understood what threat did to the place. The United States has been really isolated and safe based on having, two oceans separating us from the rest of the continents. We have threat in different areas of the country, natural disasters I talk about in the book that tightens up states, but we haven't had the same kind of chaos that happens in Europe many times that helps people remember, wait, this is not a good thing. We need to open up and work together. I remember my daughter, Hannah, my younger daughter, asked me when she was maybe 6, she's like, do we worry about Canada or Mexico invading us?
Right.
And I was like writing this down. She's actually leans on the tight side. She also asked me if colleges have a curfew, like if there's a time you need to go to bed. And I'm like, no, sweetie, you get to go to bed whenever you want. But it just made me realize, we live in a comparatively very safe context, which is what's even more remarkable, that we have a leader who's trying to tighten us to the extent that we do. He is. Whereas in Europe, there's been in many ways, people have been living around people that are different from them for many, many years. I actually have argued with my colleagues that I think cultural intelligence is higher in Europe because there's just the sheer exposure. The metaphor in the United States of the melting pot also goes against that. Just we should all be the same. Languages, we should not speak anything but English. I was just at a conference, at our National Social Psych conference, where we were talking a lot about bilingualism and the benefits of bilingualism and all the politics around that. And that's all because of what Lakoff would say is a metaphor. Like we're supposed to be a melting pot. And, Canada has a nice salad bowl metaphor where like everyone maintains the distinct element, but they coexist. So, maybe that's another way to think about culture change is how do we change the metaphor that we have in the U.S. to help people to appreciate this place has always been a place of immigrants, where we benefit from different perspectives. We've had in the past a healthy balance of looseness and tightness in the sense that we've been open, but also had a lot of order. And so we should strive to balance that.
Yeah, when I first met my wife, she's from Cologne, Germany, and in North Westphalia there. And so I tried to make some little thing about, I love Oktoberfest and beer, and she's like, and later host, and she goes, oh, that's those Bavarians, they're a bunch of rednecks. I'm like, oh, cultural differences within Germany. Okay, I get it. Sort of like how Californians make fun of Southerners or whatever, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, actually, in the book, I talk a lot about how even if we can classify countries in general and tight and loose, that there's always interesting pockets and regions that evolve to be tight or loose, or even domains. In Japan, for example, which is a really pretty tight culture. I don't know if you've ever been there. I mean, it's just perfect example of like order and synchrony, but also, some degree of intolerance. There's a funny story about a train conductor apologizing that there were too many foreigners on board the train. There's this this is what you'll find in Japan, but it's a very clean and orderly place and very low crime. There's such low crime that, people, even police officers have been known to try to egg people on,
right, just to
commit crime. This was on Wait, Don't Tell Me recently. That Japanese police officers are so bored that they try to get people to commit crimes. But in any event, even in that context of tightness, there's some elements of looseness, like the drinking culture, or some like art cultures, or some places where you just have almost like allowable looseness. Same with other places, even in Iran. I mean, it's not written about Iran. It is obviously much tighter, but lots of pockets of looseness. And in fact, we would argue that you need that from a Goldilocks principle. And in the U.S. and in other loose cultures, there's also pockets of tightness. I would say that, we're pretty tight on privacy. I would just show up, unless it's Halloween, at my neighbor's door and ask for food. It's like
right.
I like to try to violate norms like this sometimes just to see how people react, or in New Zealand, which is really pretty loose, where people walk barefoot in banks and there's a lot of permissiveness. You'll still find very, very strict norms around, interestingly enough, egalitarianism. It's something called the tall poppy syndrome. Like if you try to stand out in New Zealand, you get pushed down right away. It's a very strong norm. And tightness when it comes to that value. So I think every culture has their tightness that evolves around wanting to protect very core values.
That's what I was going to ask you about Alan Fiske's relational models and how that fits with your tightness, looseness. His 4 relational models are communal sharing, authority ranking, equality matching, and market pricing. And that, for example, if you go to a restaurant and you say, "Oh, I can't pay, but I'll have you over for dinner," that's not going to fly. Or like Woody Allen's little joke that I like to use. He says, he's wearing a watch. He says, on his deathbed, my grandfather sold me his watch. You
gotta love Woody Allen. This, like you said, it's really remarkable for scientists to come at reality in different ways. I mean, his is really about the relational level of analysis. Jonathan Haidt's about morality. My stuff is about norms. But there's some kind of coexistence of Venn diagrams where authority ranking and communal sharing, are models that help people to abide by rules, and they're pretty normative. And so there's a correlation. I never measure his models, but there's measures of collectivism or power distance that overlap with his models, and they clearly overlap with tightness. And same with some of Haidt's moral foundations. We can see that at the national and state level that you have more of those communal and authority and purity type codes that correlate with strong norms. So there is some kind of overlap. And they're coming from different levels of analysis, but they tend to be pretty complementary.
Yeah. I want to ask your opinion on terrorism, the motivation of terrorism. As you know, most atheists like Dawkins and Harris, hit the religion angle pretty hard. They're delusional, believing this nonsense. And if they didn't believe this, they would not be motivated to blow themselves up. But other people, more sociologically oriented, think it has to do with these norm differences. They just see the Western tradition as just being violative of their norms, and we're not just minding our own business. We're over there in their country with our troops. And so, what are your thoughts on terrorism and the motivation?
Yeah, well, I do quite a bit of research on terrorism, and I interview detained terrorists, try to understand their motivations. I've been in Manila to do that. I've been to Sri Lanka, trying to understand the motivations of former Tamil Tigers. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's always going to be some variation, and this is work with R.A. Kuglansky at Maryland and others, where there's a real, kind of simple logic to why a lot of people are attracted to terrorist ideologies. And it has nothing to do with religious belief. I mean, many of these people don't even understand the Quran or understand any kind of specific ideology. But typically it's because people feel some sense that they need to belong to something, that they feel that they've been humiliated or they've been ostracized or they've been made to feel insignificant or their group was made to feel this way. And then you have that meets the network, like people then start kind of looking for those people. They're smart. Like leaders of ISIS are smart. Leaders of terrorist groups are smart. They know who might be attracted to them, and then they can give them a certain ideology. So, for example, I published a paper with Sarah Lyons, a former student of mine who's at Stanford Spark now, the Center for Do Tanking, it's called, rather than think tank. And we studied immigrants in the United States, and we found that immigrants by far wanted to integrate in the United States, but those that felt marginalized, that didn't have a home anymore in their old culture, and also felt excluded in the United States, felt culturally homeless. They were the ones that were more at risk for radical ideologies. So this is purely psychological, social psychological. And I remember I came out talking about this in a Washington Post article, and I got a lot of crap from people to say, oh, she's saying, well, welcome Muslims and just give them a big hug. And I'm like, no, the simple story is this. Either we're going to welcome them or ISIS will welcome them. Like, that's the bottom line. Right. Because, they are out there trying to find people who want a cause. Also in the book, I talked about how even things like excessive looseness can make people feel a sense of like, they feel lost. And they might be attracted to go to something that feels like that I have a purpose, like I have a group that I belong to. And so they look for people like that too. So it's very multidimensional, but it's certainly, I would really disagree that it's a religious phenomenon for the most part, and that it's not a psychopathological issue. And that we need to identify those conditions. And of course, with this whole immigration kind of disaster and how Trump and others are playing this up, it's probably further alienating a lot of immigrants, of course, who have been victim of a lot of false statistics. And I live in a county that's, pretty poor, a lot of immigrants in PG County, Maryland. And I've heard a lot of stories from people who feel really unsafe and homeless, and so anyway, this is how I understand it. I'm really interested also now in the psychology of refugees and immigrations, who are people who are going to tight and loose societies, because our research with Sarah Lyons had shown that, trying to go to Germany is a far more difficult process than coming to the US, because people felt like it's much tighter, that they don't belong, that they feel they're excluded. It happens in the U.S. also, but we're a much looser culture. So we're trying to understand the dynamics and how to prevent misunderstandings across immigrants and refugees communities and the host nationals, and try to create dialogue around this. Maybe even like the Pakistani-U.S. study I was telling you, like if we can get people to really understand each other's lives, they're sort of separated in their own echo chambers, they might actually have more empathy and less stereotyping.
Yeah.
Each other.
In Germany, the Angela Merkel opening up the borders for Syrian refugees to come in, that just seemed like a good thing to do, the right moral thing to do. Don't we have a moral obligation to help people in need? Yes, we do. But now, of course, there's a lot of pushback because some crime rates have gone up, and some Muslim issues there, and so on. And there's some balance to find there. But,
especially in Germany, where that was something that was pretty risky to have that kind of pendulum shift of like closed-mindedness to then let's let everyone in. Like that probably was a real problem. It's also, like you said earlier, the availability heuristic. People. I have friends and colleagues, Iraqi colleagues in Germany who are working on this project with us, who anytime something happens, like with a Muslim or an immigrant, they have to stay at home for a couple of days. They have to keep their kids at home. Like it's just, even if like a German did this kind of stuff, it's just more salient. Same here, and I think I was really amazed when this Iowa girl was killed, Molly Trippett, and her father got out there and said, do not blame immigrants on this. Like, this is not about immigration, just like neo-Nazi stuff is not about you're white. I mean, it was really powerful, his statement. And those kind of people really help to diffuse this kind of availability heuristic and to stand up and say, even it's my own daughter, but don't tell me that this is an immigration problem. Like I was just blown away by that episode. And we need some more of that in all of these countries around this irrational expectation around immigrants. I'm actually doing a study right now looking at how much people are misestimating immigration and what kind of jobs people are taking. It's building on Alicinia's interesting paper on misperceptions of immigrants. He's an economist at Harvard, and we're trying to understand how this connects with the 50 states and tightness, and how do you educate people around the real news, around the real statistics of this, because people grossly misestimate what percentage of the country is immigrants, illegal immigrants, and what kind of jobs they're taking and where they're coming from and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in California, we have in Southern California, especially have a large Hispanic community here, many illegals, but I welcome them. I mean, I don't want those jobs, and most Americans would not want those jobs.
Exactly. That's precisely right.
So my attitude is just let economics determine how many people will come. When there's no more jobs and there's no more money, they won't come. And
well, it's also just a form of racism, because really what's the problem is, I'm sure you've read about this too, is that it's about which immigrants are coming here.
Right.
It's not Eastern Europeans or Europeans. Now they look darker.
Right.
And that's a big part of this issue, is that kind of racist philosophy around immigration. And it's not really just about immigrants. It's about where are they coming from and how they look different from us. And again, like if we were just to have a window into people's lives, we might have a lot more empathy and realize they're a lot more like us than we thought.
Well, yeah, and that shifting norms a century ago, it was the Irish that we were worried about, or the Germans coming over. And, and then now it's like, oh, those are okay because, they're white or something.
They're white.
but a century ago, people could tell the Irish and the German, they look different and they act different. And
they sound different.
They sound different, yeah. Exactly. So, well, Michele, we've been going for over an hour and a half. So,
whoa, really?
Yeah. Well, I'm no Joe Rogan, we're not going to do 4 hours, but...
Well, I just love chatting with you, and I was so looking forward to being in the program.
The book is great. What's next on the book front? I know you're always publishing papers and stuff, but
well, we have a common agent, Katinka Matson at Brockman, and I don't think right now I'm focused on a lot of research and other endeavors. I'm working with Peter Churchin, who I'm sure you know of. He's trying to mathematize history. We're trying to do some research on tight loose across many thousands of years and the evolution of tightness, and doing some work on neuroscience and understanding psychology and neuroscience of stigma and how people perceive people who are different. Doing lots of work on Goldilocks, trying to think about how do we kind of promote Goldilocks in different contexts, whether it's the Navy or it's in organizations or it's in our household. So, I'm excited to continue being on podcasts like this and talking to people out there versus staying in the ivory tower. I'm not sure when I would write another book. I loved it, but it's definitely probably another couple of years from now, 5 years.
A practical guide for politicians and negotiators or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I have thought about, kind of how you should unlearn everything you learned about negotiation through getting to yes models. I love my colleagues, but that book works really well in those principles in our ecology, ecology where we have swift trust, where we can change partners very easily, where we have strong institutions. And when I do work in the Middle East on negotiation, they just think that's stupid. Like, why would you ever have swift trust? Like, we have swift distrust here. Like, you got to negotiate from distrust. And there's strong reasons why the culture of honor makes sense there, that you're negotiating that first over money. So I might want to write a book on negotiating, getting to yes and culture. So that would be kind of exciting, because I'm crazy about studying and teaching about negotiation.
You travel a lot.
I try to travel and like be efficient, you know, and because I'm also a mom to 2 teenagers and wife, and I also have a dog. So,
so what is your parental philosophy on tightness, looseness in your family? There's a distinction between authoritarian parents and authoritative parents. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I have to say, like, I had been worried about the teenage years for a little while. You know, I threatened that we're going to move to Singapore if they misbehave and things like that.
No more gum.
But, you know, I think, you know, I've had a really great run with the teenage years. My daughter's going to be going to college next year, and others in high school. And I think we just really open and communicate. And as I mentioned, I really do try to negotiate, like the domains that are really have to be tight are like, you work hard in school, you treat each other well, you know, are respectful to people. But then when it comes to like messiness, I'm like, whatever, like you could be a total slob. And I'm just not going to look at your room. And, you know, and the house is kind of really messy. And I mentioned Todd, who's a lawyer, and those professions veer tight for good, accountable reasons.
Yep.
He's a little disturbed by how messy the house is. But I feel like it's pretty cool because they know the tight, loose terminology. I mean, neither of them, the kids, are interested in psychology, but they're like, be like, Mom, I noticed something about tightness today. Or, you know, they're kind of understand it. And that language gives them the power to talk about norms in ways that, like, for example, I'm like, I'm not going to follow you on your phone, but my underlying interest, this is me coming from a negotiation point of view, is that I know you're safe. So the solution is you tell me where you are. Like, you text me when you're leaving places and let me know where you are. And that works out pretty well because I don't want to spy on her, but I want to feel like, you know, we're safe. So we negotiate a lot, you know, and that's both tightness, looseness, perspective plus negotiation seems to work pretty well.
Cell phones are good for that. You can call her anytime on a cell phone. That's good for that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think also they know a lot about culture because we live in a very diverse place, and they appreciate all this kind of diversity, and they could talk about it. They can make fun of each other's diversity. And so that's a good balance.
I presume you would think that the forthcoming Chinese system of social monitoring everybody and giving credits and so on is a little too tight.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's a new paper I'm writing a commentary on for PNAS that will be coming out soon. This paper where they actually use my measure and they look at tight, loose across the 30 plus provinces in China. And, you know, it's really interesting because the places that are really very constrained, where there's a lot of government intervention, are also the ones that are most economically productive. And China is an interesting place because the government's kind of pretty smart, I think, about having a lot of rules, particularly in urban areas that have huge population density. And people, by the way, there want those rules. Like, even on the internet, of course, you can't always trust these surveys. You know, Chinese are like, I don't want people smearing my reputation on the internet. I want some accountability on the internet. So we kind of project our freedom to think, oh, those poor, you know, people in China. It's not true. Like, they actually welcome some degree of monitoring. And I think that maybe the part of the answer might be that it's a, you know, it also gives them a sense that they're also economically productive, that there's a strange combination of monitoring and also productivity and happiness that seems to be strategically engineered by the government. So it's complicated. I'll send you the commentary when I finish it.
I'm interested in that. Yeah. No, I know what your next book could be. The sequel to this should be the 12 rules for a tight, loose life.
Yeah, that would be like, I'll get famous like Jordan Peterson if I have that. Right?
You could do something with lobsters and hierarchies and.
I'm going to make it the 10 rules. You know, you got to reduce the number of rules.
That's right. Yeah. Actually, you make me think of another reason why Jordan is so popular. I mean, people ask me all the time, why is this guy so popular? In part, he's basically saying, you know, life is hard, and you got to get your life in order. You got to have rules. He has this whole thing, making your bed and, do all these rituals, these small wins in the morning, and you leave the house and everything is orderly.
Yeah.
That's kind of a tight argument, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a mix. And he's also like, you should have responsibility for your own life. And, that's also a sense quasi-individualistic, but I agree. I haven't read his whole book, but I mean, most of the principles, just looking at them in brief, look pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
They're not like things you'd be like, oh no, like you shouldn't, take care of yourself, and you shouldn't, listen to other people and think that they have something new to say. Like, some of it sounds like, of course, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I have to look through it in more detail, but I'd like to figure out a book like that.
I just think a lot of people haven't heard that, or they haven't thought about it. We did an issue of Skeptic on the self-help and actualization movement, SHAM, sham, because basically it doesn't work in any scientific sense. It only works if you keep reading the books and keep buying the tapes and keep repeating the rituals and so on. So it's not, there's no one program that works. It's just having something to do or focus on. That seems to be the key. And I think a lot of people are never.
And also just that you've heard it. Yeah, maybe you just heard it in a new place now. It's not just coming from, your Hebrew school or your church or your parents, but now some big academic is telling you this. Like, there must be something to this. So it could be just a matter of the memes are spreading in ways that, he capitalized on. And because I think it's true that most of them don't seem any controversial. I mean, I haven't read it, so I can't speak to every one of the 13 principles, but.
Yeah, no, I read the book. I've gotten a couple of his shows, and I've gotten to know him a little bit. He's a good guy. He's a really nice guy. He really wants to help. He's a clinical psychologist.
Yeah.
And his talks are not political, although he became a political figure because of that Bill C-16. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but it's just stuff that I thought about when I was reading your book. I think there is something there. You've captured a really important dimension of human life that I think brings a new perspective on things. So thank you for writing the book. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks
Great
so
conversation,
much.
Michele. We'll talk to you later.
Okay, great. We'll stay in touch. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.